Germany is dying, not slowly, not quietly, but right in front of the entire world, and almost nobody is talking about it. In 2024, Germany's economy shrank for the second year in a row. The country that built the most reliable cars on Earth, that powered Europe for a century, that survived 2 world wars and reunification is now contracting. Factories are closing, companies are leaving, and the workers who built their entire lives around German industry are being left behind. This isn't a recession, this is something much more permanent. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how one of the most powerful economies in history began dismantling itself, and what it means for the rest of the world. Let's go back to the beginning. For most of the 20th century, Germany's economic model was the envy of the world. It was built on 3 pillars. First, cheap Russian natural gas. Second, a massive export market in China. Third, the engineering genius of German manufacturing. Companies like Volkswagen, BASF, Siemens, and ThyssenKrupp that made products so good the whole world wanted to buy them. For decades, this model worked perfectly. Germany became the largest economy in Europe and the 3rd largest in the world. German workers earned high wages. German companies dominated global markets. The phrase "made in Germany" meant something. It's worth pausing here to understand just how unusual Germany's post-war success really was. After 1945, the country was physically destroyed. Major cities were reduced to rubble. Industrial capacity was a fraction of pre-war levels. And yet within 25 years, West Germany had rebuilt itself into an industrial powerhouse, a phenomenon so remarkable that economists gave it a name, the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. That miracle wasn't an accident. It was built on specific choices. A currency reform in 1948 that stabilized prices overnight. A deliberate focus on vocational training that gave German workers world-class technical skills. A consensus between unions and employers that prioritized long-term investment over short-term profit. And crucially, access to cheap energy and stable export markets that allowed German companies to compete on quality rather than just price. For decades, this combination seemed unbeatable. While other countries struggled with strikes, inflation, and industrial decline in the 1970s and 80s, Germany kept producing. Its current account surpluses became legendary. Germany exported far more than it imported year after year, decade after decade. By the 2000s, Germany was running some of the largest trade surpluses in human economic history. But here's the thing about building your entire economy on 3 pillars. If one of them collapses, you have a problem. If 2 of them collapse at the same time, you have a crisis. That's exactly what happened, and it happened faster than anyone expected. Pillar number 1, cheap Russian gas gone. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Germany faced a choice it had been avoiding for years. For decades, German politicians, from both left and right, had built an energy policy almost entirely dependent on Russian natural gas. The logic seemed sound at the time. Economic interdependence would prevent conflict. If Russia and Germany needed each other for trade, neither would go to war. That theory died on February 24, 2022. To understand how dependent Germany really was, consider this. Before 2022, Russia supplied over 55% of Germany's natural gas imports. Not 10%, not 20%. More than half of the gas heating German homes, powering German factories, and running German power plants came from a single source. A source controlled by a government that German leaders had just watched annex Crimea in 2014. Why did Germany keep building this dependency even after that warning sign? The answer involves billions of dollars, powerful lobbying, and a former chancellor who personally championed the relationship. Gerhard Schröder, Germany's chancellor from 1998 to 2005, pushed hard for the Nord Stream pipeline projects connecting Russia directly to Germany under the Baltic Sea. After leaving office, Schröder took a position on the board of Nord Stream AG. Later, he joined the board of Rosneft, the Russian state oil giant. The man who built Germany's energy dependency on Russia was personally profiting from that exact relationship. This wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was a deliberate policy choice, defended for years by politicians across the political spectrum, because cheap energy meant cheap production costs, which meant competitive exports, which meant economic growth. Nobody wanted to ask what would happen if that gas ever stopped flowing. There was also a deeper assumption at play, one that went beyond simple economics. Many German policymakers genuinely believed in a strategy sometimes called Wandel durch Handel, change through trade. The idea was that by binding Russia's economy closely to Europe's, Russia would gradually become more democratic, more stable, and less likely to pursue military aggression. It was the same logic the West had applied to China for decades. In both cases, the bet failed to account for the possibility that authoritarian governments could accept economic integration while still pursuing geopolitical ambitions that had nothing to do with trade. Because cheap energy meant cheap production costs, which meant competitive exports, which meant economic growth. Nobody wanted to ask what would happen if that gas ever stopped flowing. Industrial users, the backbone of the German economy, were hit even harder because they used vastly more energy per company than any household ever could. For German industry, this was catastrophic. Energy-intensive sectors, chemicals, steel, glass, ceramics, paper, suddenly faced energy costs that made production economically impossible. Not difficult, not challenging, impossible. BASF, the world's largest chemical company, headquartered in Ludwigshafen, Germany for over 150 years, announced it would permanently shrink its European operations. They didn't say they were struggling. They said the era of cheap energy in Germany was over, and they were moving production to the United States and China. When the world's largest chemical company tells you the business conditions in your country are permanently broken, you should listen. The ripple effects went far beyond one company. Chemical production is what economists call an upstream industry. It provides essential materials that thousands of other manufacturers depend on. Fertilizer for farms, plastics for packaging, industrial solvents for paint, electronics, and pharmaceuticals. When Germany's chemical sector shrinks, it doesn't just affect chemical workers. It raises costs and creates supply uncertainty for almost every other manufacturing sector in the country. The German government scrambled to respond. It built new liquefied natural gas import terminals at record speed. Terminals that would normally take 5 to 7 years to construct were operational within months. It signed new long-term gas contracts with Qatar, the United States, and Norway. These were genuinely impressive logistical achievements. But speed came at a cost. LNG is fundamentally more expensive than pipeline gas. It has to be cooled to extremely low temperatures, shipped across oceans, and then converted back into usable gas at the destination. Even with the new terminals running at full capacity, German industrial energy prices settled at levels 2 to 4 times higher than before the war, and there is no realistic path back to the old prices. Pillar number 2, China as an export market collapsing. For 30 years, China was Germany's greatest customer. German cars, German machinery, German industrial equipment, China couldn't get enough of it. At the peak, China accounted for over 30% of Volkswagen's global sales. But China changed. Chinese companies, backed by government subsidies and decades of technology transfer, learned to build their own cars, their own machinery, their own industrial equipment, and they learned to build it cheaper. BYD, the Chinese electric vehicle company, is now the largest EV manufacturer in the world. They are selling cars in Europe and in Germany's own backyard at prices German automakers simply cannot match. But the China problem goes deeper than just competition on price. For decades, German companies made a strategic bet. They would manufacture in China, sell to Chinese consumers, and benefit from one of the fastest growing markets in human history. Volkswagen built joint ventures with Chinese partners. BMW and Mercedes followed similar paths. The bet paid off spectacularly for nearly 20 years. The unspoken price of that bet was technology transfer. To operate in China, foreign automakers had to partner with domestic Chinese companies. They had to share manufacturing knowledge, supply chain expertise, and engineering know-how. China's government openly described this strategy for decades. Absorb foreign technology, then build domestic champions who could eventually compete globally and even replace the very companies that taught them. Champions who could eventually compete globally and even replace the very companies that taught them. That strategy worked exactly as planned. Chinese battery technology, motor design, and software systems for electric vehicles are now considered equal to, or in some cases ahead of their German counterparts. The student didn't just catch up to the teacher. In key areas of electric vehicle technology, the student became the teacher. This leaves German automakers in an impossible position. They cannot easily exit the Chinese market because it remains massive and important. But staying means competing against companies that learned the business from the inside, with government financial backing German companies don't have access to, and with lower labor costs that German engineering alone cannot offset. There's an additional twist that makes this especially painful for Germany. The global shift toward electric vehicles plays directly against traditional German strengths. For a century, German engineering excellence centered on the combustion engine. Precision machining, fuel efficiency, transmission technology refined over generations. Those skills, while remarkable, simply matter less in an electric vehicle, where the critical components are batteries, electric motors, and software. China, starting from a less developed combustion engine industry, had less institutional baggage holding it back. Chinese companies built their EV industry from scratch, optimized entirely around the new technology, while German companies tried to adapt decades of combustion engine infrastructure, supplier relationships, and engineering culture to a fundamentally different kind of vehicle. In some ways, Germany's traditional strength became a disadvantage in the transition. Volkswagen, the company that is almost synonymous with Germany itself, announced in 2024 that it was considering closing German factories for the first time in its 87-year history. Not restructuring, not downsizing, closing for the first time in its 87-year history. Think about what that means. Volkswagen has never closed a German factory, not during the oil crisis of the 1970s, not during the 2008 financial crash, not during COVID. But the combination of high energy costs and Chinese competition has done what decades of crises could not. And it's not just Volkswagen. Across German industry, the story is the same. ThyssenKrupp cutting thousands of jobs, Miele moving production out of Germany, Continental closing plants across the country. The deindustrialization of Germany is not a warning. It is already happening. The human cost of this transition is not abstract. In towns across Germany that built their entire identity around a single factory or industry, the closures mean something far more personal than a line on an economic report. Take the Saarland region, historically built on steel and coal production. Unemployment there has been rising as industrial employers scale back operations. Multiply that story across dozens of towns in Bavaria, North Rhine-Westphalia, and Baden-Württemberg, regions where one company sometimes employs an entire town's working population across multiple generations. These are skilled workers, engineers, machinists, technicians who spent years training for jobs that suddenly don't exist anymore. Retraining an entire workforce doesn't happen in months. It takes years, often a full decade, and requires massive investment the government has been slow to provide. Consider what a factory closure actually means for a worker in their 50s who has spent 30 years on the same assembly line. They are too specialized to easily transfer their skills, and in a job market that increasingly values software and data skills over precision manufacturing expertise. Many younger workers are choosing to leave Germany entirely, taking their training to the United States, Switzerland, or elsewhere in Europe, where the industrial outlook seems more stable. This is the part of deindustrialization that doesn't show up in GDP statistics right away, but shows up in something far more important: the trust people have in their government, their economic system, and their own future. And when that trust erodes, the political consequences can be far more disruptive than the economic ones. Germany has a deeper structural problem hidden for years. The country has chronically underinvested in its own infrastructure and its own future. While Germany was running budget surpluses and congratulating itself on fiscal discipline, its roads were crumbling, its bridges were deteriorating, its internet infrastructure fell decades behind, its schools were underfunded, its military was hollowed out. The numbers here are genuinely surprising for a country with Germany's reputation for engineering precision. As of the mid-2020s, Germany ranks near the bottom of major European economies for average broadband internet speeds. Major bridges on critical motorways have had to be partially or fully closed for emergency repairs, causing massive logistics disruptions for an economy that depends heavily on efficient transportation of goods. The Ramede Viaduct, a critical bridge connecting major industrial regions, was closed in 2021 due to structural deterioration, and remained a major bottleneck for years afterward, costing the regional economy enormous sums in delayed shipments and rerouted traffic. Germany has a constitutional rule called the debt brake, the Schuldenbremse, which severely limits government borrowing. In theory, this sounds responsible. In practice, it meant Germany refused to invest in the things that every modern economy needs to compete in the 21st century. The debt brake was introduced after the 2008 financial crisis as a response to genuine concerns about fiscal irresponsibility seen in some other European countries, most notably Greece. German policymakers, scarred by the hyperinflation of the 1920s and determined never to be seen as financially reckless, built a system that made it extremely difficult for the government to borrow money even for productive long-term investments. The intention was discipline. The result was paralysis. And now, just when Germany desperately needs to invest in new energy infrastructure, in semiconductor factories, in artificial intelligence, in retraining workers, it finds itself politically paralyzed. And now, just when Germany desperately needs to invest in new energy infrastructure, in semiconductor factories, in artificial intelligence, in retraining workers, it finds itself politically paralyzed. Coalition governments collapse. Reform gets blocked. The debt brake ties the hands of anyone who wants to act boldly. This paralysis became visible in November 2024, when Germany's coalition government collapsed over disagreements about how to fund these investments. The finance minister wanted to maintain strict adherence to the debt brake. Other coalition partners wanted to suspend it temporarily to fund industrial transition programs. The disagreement was severe enough to bring down the entire government, triggering new elections at precisely the moment Germany could least afford months of political uncertainty. This triggered new elections at precisely the moment Germany could least afford months of political uncertainty. Meanwhile, the United States passed the Inflation Reduction Act, pumping hundreds of billions of dollars into green energy and advanced manufacturing. China's state support for its electric vehicle and battery industries, when calculated across direct subsidies, tax breaks, cheap land, and low-cost financing from state banks, likely exceeds even those American figures. The Inflation Reduction Act alone directed hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies and tax credits toward clean energy manufacturing in the United States over a decade. China's state support for its electric vehicle and battery industries, when calculated across direct subsidies, tax breaks, cheap land, and low-cost financing from state banks, likely exceeds even those American figures. Germany, constrained by both the debt brake and European Union state aid rules designed to prevent unfair competition between member states, simply cannot match either approach, even if its politicians wanted to. There is also a uniquely German dimension to this crisis: demographic decline. Germany's population is aging rapidly. Its workforce has been shrinking relative to its retired population for years. This means that, even before accounting for deindustrialization, Germany faces a shrinking pool of working-age taxpayers supporting a growing population of retirees, while simultaneously needing massive new investment in infrastructure and industrial transition. Germany simultaneously needs massive new investment in infrastructure and industrial transition. The economic mathematics here are genuinely difficult. Fewer workers, more retirees, urgent need for investment, and constitutional limits on borrowing to pay for any of it. Germany faces a future it wasn't built for. So what happens next? There are two possible paths. The optimistic path says Germany has been here before. After reunification in 1990, Germany absorbed a broken East German economy and rebuilt it over 15 years. Germany has world-class engineering talent, strong institutions, and a culture of precision and reliability that doesn't disappear overnight. If Germany can reform its energy policy, modernize its infrastructure, and adapt its industrial base to new technologies, it can compete. Some signs of this are already visible. Germany is building new LNG terminals. It is investing in hydrogen technology, with several pilot projects aiming to use renewable energy to produce hydrogen for heavy industry that cannot easily run on electricity alone, such as steel production. Some German companies are pivoting aggressively to electric vehicles and renewable energy. Germany also still possesses genuine structural advantages: a skilled workforce, a strong vocational training system that other countries actively try to copy, and deep expertise in precision engineering and industrial automation that takes decades to replicate. There is also a possible silver lining in the political shock of the 2024 government collapse. The crisis forced an open national debate about the debt brake that had been avoided for years. Early signals from the new government elected in 2025 suggested at least some willingness to reform fiscal rules to allow greater investment in defense, infrastructure, and industrial transition. Though, as with most German political compromises, the details remained contested and the pace of change remained slow by the standards of how quickly the underlying economic problems were unfolding. The pessimistic path says the damage is already structural and permanent, that the companies leaving Germany are not coming back, that the energy cost advantage is gone forever, that the companies leaving Germany are not coming back, that the energy cost advantage is gone forever, that China will continue to improve and undercut German manufacturers in every major export market, and that Germany's political system is too slow, too cautious, and too divided to respond at the speed the situation demands. Some economists argue that Germany's entire post-war model was always more fragile than it appeared, because it depended on a specific and temporary alignment of global conditions: cheap energy from a stable supplier, an enormous and rapidly growing export market willing to absorb German goods without yet being able to produce equivalent goods domestically, and a relatively favorable position within global trade rules. Each of those conditions has now changed, and they are unlikely to return to their previous state. If this view is correct, Germany isn't simply going through a difficult adjustment period. It is being forced to build an entirely new economic model from a weaker starting position than the one that built the original Wirtschaftswunder. The honest answer is that nobody knows which path Germany will take, but here is what we do know. The decisions made in the next 3 to 5 years will determine whether Germany remains a major industrial power or becomes a cautionary tale about what happens when a country mistakes the success of the past for a guarantee of the future. Germany built its prosperity on a world that no longer exists. Cheap Russian gas is gone. China is no longer just a customer, it is a competitor. And the old model of selling premium industrial products to a globalized world is under pressure from every direction. Germany built its prosperity on a world that no longer exists. Cheap Russian gas is gone. China is no longer just a customer, it is a competitor. And the old model of selling premium industrial products to a globalized world is under pressure from every direction. The question facing Germany right now is the same question facing every developed economy sooner or later. How do you reinvent yourself when the thing that made you great stops working? For Germany, the clock is ticking. The factories closing today will not reopen tomorrow. The engineers and workers leaving for other countries will not come back easily. The window for transformation is open, but it will not stay open forever. The world is watching, because what happens in Germany doesn't stay in Germany. Germany is the economic engine of Europe, its largest economy, and for decades, the anchor that other European countries oriented their own economic policies around. If that engine stalls permanently, the consequences will ripple across the entire continent and far beyond. Germany's economic stability has long been one of the foundations that gave the broader European project its credibility. Germany's economic stability has long been one of the foundations that gave the broader European project its credibility, particularly within the Eurozone. A Germany in sustained industrial decline doesn't just mean fewer German jobs. It potentially means a weaker anchor for the entire European currency union, less German capacity to support struggling economies elsewhere in Europe, and a shift in the continent's center of economic gravity that could reshape European politics for a generation. It's also worth stepping back and asking why this matters to anyone outside Germany or Europe. The answer connects to a broader pattern playing out across the developed world. For most of the post-war era, wealthy nations operated on a shared assumption. Globalization was a one-way escalator. Rich countries would keep their high-value manufacturing and design work, while lower-cost countries handled simpler production. Supply chains would keep getting longer, more efficient, and more interconnected, because interconnection itself was assumed to be safer and more profitable than self-sufficiency. Germany was the purest expression of that bet taken to its logical extreme. No major economy leaned harder into export-driven growth, cheap imported energy, and deep integration with both Russia and China simultaneously. When the bet worked, it worked spectacularly. Germany's trade surpluses became the subject of academic study and considerable envy from other nations trying to understand the secret of German competitiveness. When the bet worked, it worked spectacularly. Germany's trade surpluses became the subject of academic study and considerable envy from other nations trying to understand the secret of German competitiveness. But the same features that made the German model so effective also made it unusually exposed when the global environment shifted. But the same features that made the German model so effective also made it unusually exposed when the global environment shifted. A country with a more diversified energy supply, a more balanced set of trading partners, and a domestic market large enough to absorb more of its own industrial output would have had more cushion to absorb the shocks of the past several years. Germany, having optimized so completely for efficiency within a particular version of globalization, had less flexibility when that version of globalization started breaking down. This is precisely why economists and policymakers in other countries are watching Germany so closely. The specific triggers, a war in Ukraine, a rising China, are particular to this moment. But the underlying lesson is general. Any economy that builds deep structural dependence on a small number of external partners for either its energy or its export markets is making a bet on those relationships remaining stable indefinitely. Germany's experience over the past several years is becoming the case study other nations use when deciding how much of that kind of dependence they are willing to accept going forward. This is precisely why economists and policymakers in other countries are watching Germany so closely. The specific triggers, a war in Ukraine, a rising China, are particular to this moment. But the underlying lesson is general. Any economy that builds deep structural dependence on a small number of external partners for either its energy or its export markets is making a bet on those relationships remaining stable indefinitely. Germany's experience over the past several years is becoming the case study other nations use when deciding how much of that kind of dependence they are willing to accept going forward. There's a parallel often drawn to earlier moments of industrial transition. Britain, the original industrial superpower of the 19th century. Britain dominated global manufacturing, shipping, and finance for generations before gradually losing that position over the first half of the 20th century, as other nations industrialized and Britain's own industrial base aged and underinvested in new technology. The decline wasn't a single dramatic event. It was a slow accumulation of missed adaptations, each one individually explainable, that collectively added up to a permanent shift in Britain's economic position in the world. The decline wasn't a single dramatic event. It was a slow accumulation of missed adaptations, each one individually explainable, that collectively added up to a permanent shift in Britain's economic position in the world. Whether Germany is at the beginning of a similar multi-decade transition, or whether it successfully adapts the way it did after reunification, remains an open question. Whether Germany is at the beginning of a similar multi-decade transition, or whether it successfully adapts the way it did after reunification, remains an open question. But the stakes of getting the answer right extend well beyond Germany's own borders, into the stability of the European Union, the security architecture of NATO that depends partly on German economic and military capacity, and the broader question of whether advanced industrial economies can successfully reinvent themselves once their original sources of competitive advantage disappear, and the broader question of whether advanced industrial economies can successfully reinvent themselves once their original sources of competitive advantage disappear. The story of German deindustrialization is not just a German story. It is a warning for every country that assumes its economic model is permanent. The story of German deindustrialization is not just a German story. It is a warning for every country that assumes its economic model is permanent. Nothing lasts forever, not even made in Germany. If this made you think differently about the global economy, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe. Because next week, we are going inside the country that turned its birth rate into a national emergency. And subscribe, because next week we are going inside the country that turned its birth rate into a national emergency. I'll see you then.